In the lesson Protecting Our Routes with a Guard, after we validated the incoming access token, we decided to auto-assign the decoded payload and put it in the request's user property. But how can we grab this object from within our protected routes? How can we determine who the identity of the current API request is? Let's grab this request object and learn how we can get the user information and utilize it within our code. Let's switch over to our IDE and open up the coffees controller file. For example's sake, let's say we'd like to retrieve the object representing the active user, aka currently logged in user, inside of the findAllGet endpoint. For demonstration purposes, let's add a new method argument called request and annotate it with the rec decorator. Next, within the method body, let's add a simple console log and log out request.user. Let's save our changes and head over to Insomnia. Let's call the coffees get route again, just so we can trigger this console log. Now if we switch back to our IDE and open up our terminal, as we can see, our decoded payload got logged in the console here. Now, even though this works, this approach seems to be far from ideal, right? First off, taking the entire request object as an input argument of our method makes it harder to test, as the request interface is generally quite broad. Another problem is that it requires an understanding of the access token guard implementation, which assigns the decoded payload to the request user key, and some people might not be aware of this, especially newcomers, people who join the project at a later stage. To simplify this whole situation, let's create a new param decorator to handle a few things for us. Inside of the IM folder, let's create a new directory and call it decorators. Inside this new folder, let's add a new file and name it active-user.decorator.ts. Inside the file, let's declare a new active user decorator with the help of createParamDecorator utility exported from Nest.js comment. If you're unfamiliar with the createParamDecorator function, we recommend looking at the bonus Create Custom Param Decorators lesson from our fundamentals course. Next up, let's pass the following function to the createParamDecorator as an argument. The code can be found below the course video. Now let's break everything down to see what we're doing here to get a better understanding of everything. In the first line here, we're grabbing the request object from the execution context using switch to HTTP and calling the getRequest method. Next, from that request object, we're selecting the decoded user payload and assigning it to the user variable. Lastly, if a field parameter was passed into the decorator, then we want to grab that corresponding field property from the user object. Otherwise, we return the entire user object. Okay, so the code here is straightforward enough so far, but will end up saving us a lot of boilerplate code and time in the future. So let's save our changes, head back to the coffees controller, and instead of using the rec object, let's now make sure to use our new active user decorator that we just created. With everything in place, let's save our changes, head over to Insomnia, and click Send again. Once we receive the response back, if we switch back to our IDE and open up our terminals again, we'll see what got logged into the console. And as we can see again, our custom decorator works as intended, and we no longer have to inject the entire request object into our handler. Great. As we mentioned earlier, now that we're not using the request itself, this will help keep tests simpler, as it would be easy to mock out our new decorator. Back to our code, there's one last thing we could improve here. So far, we haven't declared what the actual shape of our JWT payload is, which in our case represents the decoded user data. So to make things strongly typed, let's create a new file inside of the im/interfaces folder and name it active-user-data.interface.ts. Inside this file, let's start by adding the active user data interface. Inside this interface, let's declare two properties, sub and email. In our case, sub represents the user ID that granted this token, while email is just an extra user-specific property we provided in the authentication service when generating the token. JWT payload contains a few other properties which we've seen when we logged the user object in the console. For example, EXP, which is the expiration timestamp of the token, or AUD, which is the audience we passed in when generating the token. As these are irrelevant to the user and this interface, we won't be adding them to the active user data interface here. Alright, with everything here in place, let's save our changes and make use of this newly defined interface. First up, let's switch back to the active user decorator we just created. Here, we could start by strongly typing the field parameter using the key of active user data expression. And next, we can also specify the type for the user variable as follows. Perfect. Now, let's navigate to the Coffee's controller and use the active user data interface there as well, which can be found in the user parameter of our findAll method. And lastly, let's open up the authentication service and make sure that the payload we pass to the JWT service when signing the token fulfills the active user data interface. Great, now we are fully type safe and we've simplified how we can access current user data in our endpoints, all of which will come in handy in future lessons.